All right, we are live and currently recording as well. Prudence, I'll go ahead and play the intro.
Oh, I think Representative Ross just told me he's on, so.
Okay.
In times like these, we need to settle down and take a seat to talk and explore and learn so much more. At the heart of it, we're the core.
Well, good evening and welcome to all of our neighbors who are tuning in for the second episode of The Core. And before we go through with any introductions, we will begin with a short video clip that provides some context for our conversation today. Defund, dismantle, or defend the police.
You're going to be affected by that, I can guarantee you.
When Raleigh Demands Justice went to City Hall last Friday with its list of demands printed boldly on black t-shirts, number 3 on the list was defund the police. But when we snap polled Triangle protesters,
oh gosh,
not everyone's certain what it means or sold on the concept.
I'm not sure defunding the police is the way to go. I do think we really need
by defining defunding, or is it really restructuring?
Don't necessarily support defunding the police, probably because I don't know all that it entails.
And I really want for this not to be a concept that feels shocking to people.
Attorney Dawn Blagrove, one of the lead organizers for Raleigh Demands Justice, spoke to us to clear up confusion. One big question, does defund the police mean abolish the police?
Absolutely not. What it means is making the police force lean.
What Dawn describes is a gradual process. Just like public schools have been defunded to balance budgets, less art and music classes, RDJ would want to start slicing at the city of Raleigh's nearly $110 million police budget, reallocating that money to improve improve the communities police serve so fewer officers are needed, using the money to guarantee a living wage, stable housing, mental health pros who can respond to a 911 call about a person in mental crisis, not a traditional police officer.
We get rid of officers that we don't need. We get rid of bad officers or officers who have multiple grievances filed against them or a history of using excessive force. It means that we no longer ask law enforcement to be the mental health care providers, and we create a new paradigm about what community safety looks like and how we achieve it.
Still no shortage of confusion or criticism about a disinvestment in police. The National Republican Party retweeting this Monday, you know what defunding the police does? Takes away resources from rape victims, domestic abuse victims, children who are trafficked or abused. Y'all are creating a victim's worst nightmare.
Taking that money from law enforcement, if that's all that was going to happen, it would be a disaster. But what we're saying with defund the police is we take that money from law enforcement and then give it to people who have been trained to deal with the trauma of being a victim of crime.
Now, see, this move in Minneapolis to disband its police force and replace it with some other kind of public safety agency is beyond anything we're seeing here in the Triangle. But defunding the police in some form is happening here in the Triangle. We saw it last year in Durham when the city council refused the police chief's request to add 18 additional officers. The mayor's pro tem argued at the time that it was time for the city to build a crisis response model outside of traditional law enforcement. We're live at RPD's downtown district tonight. I'm Joel Brown, ABC 11 Eyewitness News.
So here to tackle some of these issues today are some amazing panelists. I'm not sure if Attorney Blagrove is on the call yet, but hopefully she will join us momentarily. But with us are two of our Elon University students and rising stars, community activists, Kennedy Boston and Casey Fontaine, both second-year students here at the university. We also have Representative Stephen Ross, a former mayor of Burlington, also joining us. He represents the 63rd District. And finally, still with us, is Chief Terrence Caldwell from Mebane. So Attorney Blagrove would have been the ideal person to start with, since it was her voice that we were hearing. But I'm going to, by way of introduction, ask each of the panelists to address some of the issues that we've heard. So I'll start with Kennedy and Casey. And a few weeks ago, both of you decided to organize a sit-in protest outside of the Alamance County Sheriff's Office. And you were photographed holding your picket signs calling for the defunding of the police. Tell us a little bit about what motivated you to organize that protest and what you hope to achieve.
Sure. I guess I can start. So, I know that for me personally, there has been a lot of things with Black Lives Matter and things like that, but we had specifically heard that Sheriff Johnson was a big figurehead in Alamance and had just been, let's just say, not the best at a lot of these things. He was detaining, he had a partnership with ICE to detain a lot of Hispanic immigrants specifically, and it said a lot of racist things, and we thought it was just time for things to change. And especially something that spurred it really was the ban on protesting that took place in Alamance County. Because initially the protest was a protest for the right to protest, as protesting was still banned in Alamance County when we decided to do the protest. But after that ban was lifted, we still recognized that Sheriff Johnson was an issue, at least in our eyes, for Alamance County. So we wanted to have our voices heard, and so we decided to do the sit-in. But Casey, you can also hop on that in any way that you might want to add on.
Yeah, sorry, I'll turn the light on in a second. It's really dark. Basically, we had both been following this idea about defunding the police, and we wanted to take that and make it local, especially when we're department or sheriff's office that we've seen poorly mistreat its citizens and abuse that power that it's been given. So our reason behind organizing it was simply that we wanted to bring awareness to what this organization was doing and the things that we thought it should be doing better, or the places that we felt, rather than give more money to this office that is abusing its power, put that money towards preventative measures to stop maybe some of the problems that police would be called on to deal with initially. And again, to stop officers within this organization who have displayed very racist tendencies, you know, to get them charged and bring attention to what they're doing and stop them.
So in your eyes, by your measure, what did your protests achieve?
I think our protest was the first protest after the ban was lifted, first of all, which I think made it clear that we are still here and we still strongly believe in this cause, and that just because you put a ban on it doesn't mean that it's going to go away. But I also think that it brought attention to a lot of the issues surrounding Sheriff Johnson, because there was a lot of reporters there and things like that. And I think that what was really good was that seeing all of those people there, and like also seeing the amount of coverage that it got, because we made it into the News and Record in Greensboro, the Burlington Times, and things like that. So I think that at a minimum, it at least put the message out there and brought awareness to this issue.
There was a protest again on Saturday after that for all of Alamance County citizens. And I think that a lot of people like recognized us or would talk to us about it, about the protest that we had organized. And, you know, they had said we had already been planning because we want to support Defund the Police, but we didn't understand just how corrupt our own organization was in our county. So that was really inspiring for me to hear. And then also I've talked to someone, a couple of administrators at Elon about Elon police force. That's where we go to school, and their relationship with the sheriff's office. They're currently in a mutual aid agreement with them. And the police officers from Elon have been called on to, you know, help disband peaceful protests and help enforce regulations that aren't constitutional. And so we have started having conversations. It's very slow and we're a little disappointed about that. But we have started having conversations with administrators at Elon about their relationship with the sheriff's department and the changes that we think need to be made. So
just so you know, I'm on that committee and it's not slow. We've been working. So stay tuned to address some of your issues. So thank you for those introductory remarks. Chief Caldwell, when you hear these young people calling for defunding a specific office, but also thinking more broadly about policing in the United States, what reaction do you have to this movement, both locally and nationwide?
Well, first of all, let me commend this group and the others who have taken on the challenge of the nation's unrest and being voices for Elon University and certainly for the community as a whole. I certainly commend you on that. So what we've learned already in this conversation is that defunding is simply not just taking away dollars from police departments. So I think the definition is very broad, from one person to another, from one group to another, but certainly it narrows down to how can a law enforcement agency do things differently? And would it be feasible to use maybe some of the funds that are appropriated towards a police department in another direction? And I think that a lot of my law enforcement partners would agree initially and say, yeah, there's some things that maybe we could shift some money, because it would be a benefit, I think, to society and to law enforcement both. The two examples that stand out are obviously mental health care and the fact that law enforcement has to deal with a lot of mental health issues. And while we receive training to deal with those that have mental health issues, we're not experts. And, you know, we're not the true professionals of that particular area. And the same thing with social work. And what we learn and find is that when you look at social work and you look at dealing with those with mental issues, that's where a lot of interaction that oftentimes becomes physical starts to occur with law enforcement. So if we could look at, for example, those two areas and say, hey, is there some funding in a law enforcement agency in which we can redirect those funds and maybe look at getting more mental health care professionals assigned to or attached to our police departments, or those in the social working field, we could perhaps attach those to a police agency, taking those funds away from law enforcement and putting those in those two fields, I think would significantly help change what's going on when the interactions occur. And there are plenty of models, I think, throughout the state. Mebane, as you all may or may not know, we're split jurisdiction. So we're Alamance, and then there's a portion of Mebane that's Orange. So I see a lot of what my partners on the Orange County side are doing, for example, is they're attaching part-time, and in some cases, Chapel Hill, for example, they have full-time social workers assigned to the police department. And again, having that subject matter expert readily accessible to deal with issues that they're better trained to deal with and to assist us with is, you know, perhaps just short of being ideal going forward. But I think just to kind of close my initial response in, is that, yeah, the funding captures a lot of different things. And so it's just not taking the dollars away from a police department. I would even contend that maybe we use the term reappropriating dollars, for example, because I think the majority of the people want to continue to see their police services, but they want to see things done differently with respect to our interactions that oftentimes become physical and violent. Is it something we can do to avoid that? So,
just as a quick follow-up, how long have you been in law enforcement?
I've been in law enforcement for approximately 34 years. Altogether, I've been with the city of Mebane for 28 years, and I've been the chief of police here in Mebane for going on 16 years now.
So since you are open to a reappropriation of funding, what are some of the areas that you could see funding being diverted from your police department or any other police department, if you want to speak more broadly in generalities, and directed to other services?
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked that, Professor Lane, because I think we have to look at the dynamics of every department. And if there were going to be a push to redirect police funding, at what level would that be managed at? Who would set these guidelines? You know, we were talking earlier about economics, and you look at Burlington, for example, versus Mebane. You've got a different population, and perhaps the socioeconomic makeup is slightly different. So would you look at Mebane? Would you have a standard to require Mebane, whose numbers might be quite different than, let's be extreme, say Winston-Salem? Would they be held to the same standard? So I don't think that we can paint this term of reappropriating with a broad tip brush. I think maybe legislation that Mr. Ross, I'm sure, will probably speak to, might channel or direct or set some guidelines, but I think we have to be very careful in redirecting a city of Mebane budget, you know, versus again, a Winston-Salem PD or Raleigh PD budget. And I should add too that, you know, some of the smaller agencies that are currently dealing with these issues, although we don't have full-time and in some cases not even part-time people assigned, we usually have county groups or organizations that we partner with, and that's another key component, I think, to this whole concept of reappropriating is the partnerships within each jurisdiction or each area that would allow law enforcement agencies to better collaborate with other subject matter experts.
Thank you. Representative Ross, you offer us a different perspective of this issue because you are a state representative, but you also are very familiar with Burlington and this area. And we heard both Kennedy and Casey talk about defunding the sheriff's office, but the funding models are not quite the same, are they not? Could you maybe speak a little bit to the funding models?
Yeah, I think you have to realize that a sheriff's office is an entity in itself. It's an elected position. It operates, each county, by constitution has a sheriff that's elected in that county, and it operates on a different model than, say, a municipal police department. I'm much more familiar with municipal, the police model with the municipalities, because that's where I've spent most of my time. And the chief is right. Each municipality is different. Each town council, city council deals with different budget issues. Every community has different budget issues. And in a lot of cases, they struggle to fund what they have. But he is correct in that one of the things that I think we recognize is there are some shortcomings in the way things are done. And I will equate it to the work that we did over the last 2 years in studying school safety. After some of the school shootings that took place, we had a committee formed in the General Assembly in North Carolina, a bipartisan committee that dug into every aspect of school safety. I mean, everything from personnel, resource officers, doors. But one of the things that we found out in all that research was that our schools things have changed, times have changed, and now there are different issues that are faced in the classroom and in the schools. And we discovered that there were not enough mental health personnel in the schools. We discovered there were not enough social workers in the schools. A list of different areas where we had shortages in the school system, that were not necessarily related to resource officers, but related to the work they had to do because they were trying to fill a role in some cases of a mental health professional, a social worker, in some cases a medical expert. And I think each police department is the same. I think that as times have changed, I think the different departments are finding that there are a lot of different areas in a community that they have to deal with that could be better served by having more mental health officials that could help, in cases where that's needed, or social workers that can help in those areas. And I think we found that also in the opioid crisis, that we found that there are a number of cases that don't need to be dealt with by police. They need to be dealt with professionals, doctors and healthcare workers, and in some cases mental health, and others that specialize in that area. And I think here in Alamance County, there's been a real move to try to create a different system rather than just in the opioid crisis, taking someone and just, hauling them down to jail, because that's not where they belong. So there's a lot of restructuring that I think needs to take place. But again, every community is different. Every municipality is a little different. Bigger cities have different issues. And I just think we're going to have to really take a serious look at adding additional resources in those areas. And it needs to be coordinated so that it's there for a department, whether it's Mebane or Burlington or any other city, to be able to have the right professionals in place to deal with things, you know, rather than take, in some cases, the action that's been taken in the past.
Are these conversations that have begun in earnest in our state assembly?
They have. Actually, there's been some funding provided. So that has all started. You know, again, it's early, and as you do it, sometimes it's like, you know, testing a COVID vaccine. You'll test different things to see what works and what works best. And then you try to improve on that. And so you'll start off with funding, and then as you find the right thing that works, then you add additional funding to it. So all of that is going on really right now.
Okay, we will come back to you about some of the initiatives that may be tested, but we're happy to welcome Attorney Dawn Blagrove. She is the Executive Director for the North Carolina Justice Policy Center, an organization that has a long history of criminal justice reform, and also one of the spearheads for Emancipate-NC. Welcome to the program. I don't know if you were able to be with us when we were playing the video of your interview with Channel 11, but you provided us with a really nice definition of what defunding and that movement really encapsulates. So if you would, by way of introduction, tell us a little bit about Emancipate-NC and the work in which you're involved.
First of all, let me apologize for being late, as I'm sure everybody can understand in these times when we're responding to things rapidly and things are moving fluidly. I had a pressing issue that I needed to resolve or at least address before I could jump on. So I apologize for being late. Emancipate-NC has been and is and will be committed to reimagining a criminal justice system that is fair and just, that systemically works on dismantling mass incarceration and also ending structural and institutional racism, which is, and I've been on the call now for about 15 minutes or maybe a little bit longer, and I just haven't heard enough of that conversation as it relates to the issues that we see with law enforcement and with defunding, for that matter. So defunding the police is, I mean, you saw my clip, so you've heard kind of my 30-second spiel on it, but it really is a concept that is, that's time has come. What I think we heard Chief Caldwell talk about is exactly where we need to come from, in that our law enforcement agencies are incredibly overstretched. They are overextended, and we are asking them in theory to do a whole bunch of things well. And what's ultimately happening is that they're doing a whole bunch of things okay, but nothing really well, because we are asking them to do too much. And as a result of that, what happens is these types of incidents that we see rearing their heads up. And let me just be clear. These incidences are not such that they have just started. This is the history of law enforcement in America. It's just that now we see it more. These aren't new instances. These things haven't just started happening. They've always happened. There just hasn't been the level of transparency that we have now. So having said all that, I think defunding the police really and truly, y'all, is about reimagining what public safety looks like. Statistically, what we know is police officers, there are so many myths that we need to bust about what police actually do as it correlates to safety. Police very rarely prevent crime. What police do is respond. Police by their very nature are a reactionary mechanism. They react to situations. What we need to do, and defunding the police is about, is shifting funds to be proactive to address the root causes of crimes that we see. One of the other myths that we hear all the time is all this rampant violent crime. There's so much violent crime, we need the police for violent crime. The reality is very little of police officers' time, or any police officer across the country for that matter, is spent addressing violent crimes. It just isn't. Most of the time that they spend is on social issues, mental health issues, domestic disputes. What we really need to be talking about is ways to allocate funding in a way that we can be proactive to addressing issues that are societal ills that ultimately result in crime, as opposed to responding to the crime itself. Because by that point it's too late and the harm is already done. And the last thing I want to address in my quick opening that I've extended, and I'm taking some personal privilege with,
Go ahead.
is the real nexus, though, the real strong nexus that we cannot negate between race, racism, the infiltration of our law enforcement agencies all across the country by white nationalists, and the fact that that is an open secret that nobody really talks about or addresses when we talk about the problems that we have in law enforcement is in and of itself a problem. I think that maybe before we get to defunding or before we get to abolishing, because I'm a criminal defense attorney, I would love for us to be able to fix society to a point where I were out of a job, where I no longer needed, there was no longer a need for criminal defense attorneys. There was no longer a need for advocates about creating a fair and just criminal justice system. That is what I want to do. I want to work myself out of a job. I would hope that our law enforcement officers are the same way. They want to work themselves out of a job. And that is the way we need to really think about addressing the problems that we're seeing. And again, a whole bunch of the problems that we're having, especially in Alamance, is about who we are giving the privilege of serving our communities. In failing schools all across the state, if a school is failing and gets a failing grade, everybody in that building gets fired and has to reapply for their job. I think the first place that we start is really and truly, and this is not a foreign concept because we see it done all the time, in police departments all across the state, let's fire these folks. If you get rehired, you keep your pension, you keep everything else, you keep all your years that you have on the job, okay? And rehire them through a race conscious, a education de-escalation conscious lens, and see who gets hired back and who doesn't. That would be a phenomenal place to start.
Well, we'll talk about some of the barriers, though, that currently prevent us from doing that. And that's the law, the legislation in North Carolina that does not allow chiefs and others to talk about personnel matters when officers are fired. And I wonder if Representative Ross can jump in here and talk a little bit about that. I don't want to get too far into that because you provided a good segue into race, and I want to go there. So quickly, if we could just hear from Representative Ross about that legislation. It's been problematic to a lot of folks. So like on some city councils have to give permission to a chief, as we saw, for example, in Wilmington, to discuss the fact that officers are relieved of their duty. But by not having this kind of national clearinghouse of who has been fired, then we see officers basically do this dance, a dance of the lemons, where they will get fired from one agency and go and apply somewhere else. So for one, I think the law needs to shift. You also pointed us to the fact that when the first police force in the United States started in Boston in 1838, that was as a reaction to what was happening in the rest of the Americas. Slavery had been abolished legally in places like the Caribbean, for example, which had a period of apprenticeship from 1834 to 1838. But with those rumblings happening in the Caribbean, I think we began then to see the emergence of these police forces, slave patrols, that were established to basically round up escaping slaves. And from 1838 onwards, as more police forces came into large cities, we began to see the ways in which systemic racism was folded into our criminal system. As one attorney told me, he doesn't like to call it the criminal justice system because there is no justice at this point. So I'd like for us to get into these issues with each other, but also if our participants would like to ask our panelists any questions, please use the Q&A feature. We see that we have some questions lined up, and we promise that we will begin getting to you as well. So Representative Ross, talk to us a little bit about this law, because it has been problematic in not being able, or local municipalities not being able to be transparent in terms of personnel issues, how they're investigated and handled, and so on.
Well, first of all, HR personnel issues are a tough topic, and it goes beyond police departments. In the short term, HR records are of anybody are protected. But I do think that when an officer is fired, if he moves on to another agency, that agency should be able to know. There should be some method for an agency to know that an officer was fired and for what reason. And that's an issue that I think has come out of a lot of these conversations, and probably something that if you go forward, I think you're going to see probably some additional discussion and maybe some action on that. But as far as short term, personnel records are, I mean, it's the same thing if you have, let's say, a doctor that is has a malpractice issue, and there have been cases where they just pick up and move somewhere else and open up. And then you find out later when they get into another situation that, hey, this has happened before. And there needs to be some method of being able to open that kind of thing up for really everything, I think. But there are certain personnel issues that have always been, restricted, and I think probably will continue to be so, especially on the short term.
We have a question.
Who has a question?
Yeah, we have a question from Chief Smythe from Burlington PD. Ashley, do you want to go ahead and read Chief Smythe's?
Sure. This question asks, is there a different opportunity to better fund social systems before defunding a police?
I don't know who that might be directed to, but anybody on the panel should be willing to respond. So is there a rather than either or, a both and?
If I could
take
that one quickly, and I promise I'll be brief. The reality is that law enforcement agencies, law enforcement departments across the country, in many instances, take up the lion's share of the city budget. As a result, it's hard to pull money away from other agencies that are already woefully underfunded without taking a hard look at an agency that is cannibalizing a city budget. For example, in Raleigh, North Carolina, the police take up a solid third of the entire city budget. I think in Charlotte is somewhere around 28% of the entire city budget. Those are huge numbers. And what we know for sure is that for those folks who understand budgets, or even for people who don't understand budgets, we also know that there is padding in other parts of those budgets that is called one thing, but ultimately finds its way back to the police department. So the raw data of how much these agencies are consuming of their city budget is probably a conservative amount of how much of that money actually goes into the police department and law enforcement. So I would say that it is difficult to pull away from other agencies before pulling from the part of the budget that has the largest share of tax dollars.
But you did mention, though, with regards to schools and teachers about firing. So I think to some degree, teachers are in the same category as law enforcement officers in terms of being asked to do a lot more than they are trained or have expertise in as well. So if schools are already struggling, is it fair to have that same mandate on teachers? And I'm just trying to be devil's advocate because I have.
I hear you.
And as bad teachers, I take it personally.
Yeah, and as the daughter of a teacher, my mother is a retired 5th grade teacher. I taught when I first came out of college. I taught social studies in high school for a number of years. I understand the difficulty of that job. But the biggest difference between teachers and law enforcement is that teachers do not have the right to kill. They do not carry weapons. They cannot shoot a student no matter how badly they want to shoot some students. You know what I mean? And I think that is, and I'm being facetious, but the point is one of such that law enforcement is a different beast. And I think that the reality that they have a license to kill because of the way that our court systems are set up, the way that our Supreme Court has interpreted qualified immunity, the way that that we insulate officers, good or bad, means that they have to be held to a higher standard of accountability. They just do.
Chief Caldwell, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think it's be a good time to go back to what Ms. Blagrove was talking about earlier with respect to hiring practices and personnel records laws. So let me just be clear to the group and those listening here. So in the state of North Carolina, at least, each officer who applies for a position is required to fill out a waiver of release before an agency can even start the background process. So while personnel records are restricted from public access, any officer who's applying with any agency has to fill that waiver of release, thereby granting that agency the authority to contact whomever. And secondarily, that waiver of release is presented to, let's just say, a previous place of employment, saying this person has given us permission to release all of their information, personnel records included. Now, this is where I challenge you all to hold us accountable, because what I say is for that agency that's hiring that hopper, nowadays, it's not because they didn't have information or knowledge of an officer's past history. It's because the administration in the agency and or the agency culture welcomes that type of employee. And I think we can all deduct that when you hire that type of employee, inevitably, it's going to come back on the agency, the community at some point in time. So where I say, yeah, personnel records are still restricted in terms of public access, in terms of who we employ, that's incumbent upon me in my department and hold us accountable because these problematic officers, in most cases, I would contend show up because agencies have decided to take a chance with them. And that's something that we talk about in the law enforcement profession. You know, you hear agency heads say, yeah, we won't hire that person if we know that person has a, bad work history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just being transparent here. I don't know, these guys and ladies, they still show up at places, and the opportunity, not only through an agency background investigation is there, but now we have the North Carolina training and standards. We have North Carolina Sheriff's Training and Standards divisions, that all of these records go. When an employee leaves Mebane Police Department, that form goes to the North Carolina Division of Training and Standards. And that's our housing base. That's the governing body for law enforcement entities. And so that information is there. And so those that are slipping through the cracks or not, maybe again, it's just agency culture, administration, et cetera. But we have to be honest with ourselves as law enforcement agencies and say, are we really conscious of who we're bringing into? Now, it's one thing to do a thorough background investigation, and Mr. Ross is a member of some group that we, that's just so deeply hidden and rooted that we don't find it. We don't discover it as thorough as the background is, versus knowing that Mr. Ross has participated in this group, this group, this group, this group, et cetera, and we're looking at this file and we say, no, we think he'll be all right. But we're going to talk to him and say, hey, you can't be a part of this, but we'll bring you on anyway. So I just wanted to bring clarification to this issue, this question of what personnel records would divulge in most cases versus what agencies know of before they choose to employ an individual.
But with regards to structural racism, Chief Caldwell, how explicit is racism articulated in some of these guidelines and manuals and background check? There might be excessive force, for example, listed. Is there a history of that? But are these statutes and policies and guidelines and mechanisms for doing the kind of background attentive to issues of race? I would suspect that they are not, unless they have been truly egregious and excessive and resulted in bodily harm or death. But also this blue wall of silence is something that from the public perception is quite real. So how do we hold you and other agency heads accountable for officers and members of the rank and file that are blatantly racist, for example?
Well, I think the process is to manage, agency heads such as myself and others is certainly going to be above the probably above the authority of city government per se, because I think you're right that there is that perception of the blue wall of silence. However, Ms. Lane, it comes back to the culture, the integrity of the agency. And so whether that officer has 3 or 4 uses of force against people of color really should be irrelevant to the point that you're looking at an applicant with 3 or 4, or potentially an employee with 3 or 4 uses of force, excessive force, or whatever the case may be. And that should be a red flag in and of itself. But is there a process set up that we in law enforcement are using that really identifies the racism issue when it comes to use of force? I would say no. I'll be transparent and tell you that with the Mebane Police Department, there is not. And our controlling mechanism is one of zero tolerance. And so we've not had to dig into those layers. But the second component of that, again, is the culture. You know what you get when you come to my department to submit your application. You decide you want to be a part of you know what the culture is when you're applying. But again, I would defer to Mr. Ross perhaps in terms of where do we find, who's going to be that governing body? Who's going to be that body that regulates agency heads in terms of their processes and assessing their personnel, particularly when it comes to use of force and tendencies that seem to be geared towards people of color.
Before we get to Representative Ross, I want to bring in our young activists into the conversation because, like any protest movement in history has taught us, the young people are the people who are the revolutionaries who create the change. So Casey and Kennedy, I turn to you and ask you about the kind of policing and world that you want to see, that you believe is more just and fair. And now that you've heard about the sheriff's entity being separate and distinctive from the way that municipalities are funded, what might be some of the strategies that you think about moving forward?
Well, I think to answer at least what we want to see in the future, I think at a baseline, just seeing that police should not be judge, jury, and executioner. I think at a very basic level, like baseline, that's at least what I would like to see. Especially since I think we've touched on this a lot, but police carry too many helmets, and like they're wearing too many hats and have too much on their plate right now. So seeing a lot of that divvied up and actually going to places or to people who actually have some expertise in that. Because I remember I actually got into a car accident once and I was having a complete panic attack, and all the cop could tell me that was on scene, he was like, calm down, everything's okay. And that's not exactly the most helpful thing in those types of situations. But he wasn't trained, of course, in how to deal with a 16-year-old girl who's having a complete and utter breakdown and on the middle of the street. So like, that's something that I think that is really on the baseline, something I want to see, like just not having police be the people who have to make these judgment calls all the time, who have to be the ones dealing with people who are going through mental health crises, or be the ones on the scene when people are going or in an abusive situation and things like that, because they're simply not obviously the most the most equipped for that type of thing. And it's hard when you're one person, of course, but we have a lot of these things in place that we have a lot of resources in place already that we just need to fund better. And I think when we talk about defunding the police as well, I think we need to really also mention that these funds have to go back into the community in some way, because there's so many underfunded things. Because in the clip that was played at the beginning, it talked about how the arts and music are defunded. And there are studies that show that when kids are involved in the arts and in music and things like that, it really is good for them. And it's better for them as they go through school and things like that. I know for me, the arts was honestly like a savior, because it just was a way to channel all of my creative energy and things like that. And that's something important that kids need, but also into other resources. Because and I think to get to some of that question, we've got to the question about taking money from other resources. We're just, I think, beyond that point of that even being a consideration, because they are so poorly funded right now. Schools already have very low funding. Teachers are underpaid at an extraordinary rate. So I think when we talk about like what we want to see, I think seeing a lot of the funding that police get actually funneled back into these communities, and seeing more like then the ability for more of these resources to actually be used because they have the proper funding to be used and things like that. So at least that's what I would like to think.
Yeah, great. And I mean, just to be clear, particular kinds of schools are not well funded.
Yes.
So if you live in a community with where your property taxes are used to allocate and not in an urban area, for example, where the majority of the residents may be renters, for example, then you're going to really come out on the poor end of things in that regard. So I think we're thinking more broadly about the larger funding models that are used for our schools as well. Casey, why don't you jump in as well and share a little bit about your vision and what you might want to see?
I'll try to make this short as possible. So Officer Caldwell talked about agency responsibility. And I think that's exactly what we need to look at when we talk about systemic racism. The police force and the criminal justice system is a racist system. People are like, well, not all cops are bad. And it's like, yes, but the system that exists allows the cops that are racist and that are doing horrible things to minorities to just get away with it and get off the hook. Representative Ross used the word shortcomings. That's a really nice word for murder. That's what's happening in a lot of these communities. And so, like, yes, we need to like reallocate funds, and we need to figure out ways to be preventative instead of just responsive. But there are also, we talked about like things on, it's obviously funding is going to be different for every community. And I agree with that. The distribution of funds is going to be very different for every community. But when we talk about law enforcement, I think that there are things that need to be passed all around the board on a state level, maybe even a federal level, laws that force these officers who are committing these hate crimes to be held accountable for their actions. We've seen so many of the people that we've talked about, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, none of Breonna Taylor's killers have been charged in any way, shape, or form. And that can't happen in a system. That's not just, that's not justice. So I really am interested to hear more about when we talk about agency responsibility, who is making these decisions about what constitutes as, an officer can stay, what can we do to create a system that does 100% hold its officers accountable and eliminates this ability for officers who do have very racist tendencies or tendencies for violence to be held accountable for their actions. And on another note, something we can talk about when we talk about things on like a federal level that should be passed is training. Because I think also, again, like while we need separate areas of expertise like mental health experts or social workers, it's also really important to talk about the officers that we are going to have, these people that we allow to carry around weapons and patrol our communities. Some in Raleigh, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in North Carolina, the average amount of training time is like 30 weeks. And that's ridiculous. That shouldn't be allowed. You should have to have so much training if you have the ability in your hands to take someone's life. And you're being put in this position where you have to make these really quick calls in a lot of these high, intense, violent situations. And the people that we are allowing to have that power and have that ability are just not the people that we want to see in these positions. So I am really curious about what we can do to start holding these officers accountable, pass laws that make it impossible for people to get away with things like that, and start making sure that we're recruiting officers who do have the words that she used, that want to work themselves out of a job and are not simply there because they like to hold a gun and they like to feel powerful.
And so it's very interesting, though, that we put the guns and that power in the hands of some very young people. I've always been an advocate of our law enforcement officers being at least 21 to 25, having some college education, basic law enforcement training, I think is basic. And you're right, there's a tremendous amount of power and discretion that comes with that power. A police officer can arrest a judge, a state representative, right? So they are among the most powerful in our society. So do we need to be looking at how we hire, which of course makes some agency heads cringe because they'll say that there's already a shortage of police officers in the country. And perhaps, that may be a place to start about who we are allowing to both serve in the military. And it's, so ironic that you can join the military at 18, but you can't have alcohol until you're 21. So there are a lot of inconsistencies and ways that we need, and the issue is so huge. So there are two books that I want to recommend, as any good professor would at this stage. One is by Radley Balco. It's called The Rise of the Warrior Cop, The Militarization of America's Police. He does a really nice job in terms that are easy to understand and a good way to follow, that gives you the ways in which the police forces in the United States came to be, from European influences to their early beginnings as slave patrols, to the rise of SWAT, and so on. And the other one just went out of my head. It will come back though, but I think that it's really important for us to understand the ways in which the police have historically functioned and still do, and why those issues still remain so pervasive, especially for Black people in this country and for people of color more broadly as well. Representative Ross, we said we were gonna come back to you. And if you want to jump in here, because I think what's emerging right now are some mandates to you and your colleagues to really look at the ways in which our laws are failing us, especially with regards to issues of policing, but also with the intersection of race. So what can we do as ordinary citizens to move the conversation and the work forward in Raleigh?
I step back just a moment to a city council role or a mayor role, and I think it's incumbent on every community to make sure that their city councils and their mayors are tuned into what's going on and the changes that are taking place, so that they can make sure that the funding that they allocate to different agencies within their jurisdictions are going into the areas of need. And we've mentioned several times, teachers wear many hats. They wear many more hats than they used to. You know, like I said earlier, school nurse, counselor, mental health advisor. And it's the same with police officers. And so we need to make sure that that the funding mechanisms are there, because the needs seem to be getting greater in certain areas. And I think the funding needs to follow the need. But going back to training, some departments have very extensive training. I know Burlington, for example, has a very extensive training program. Burlington is also a member of the National Accreditation Group. And I think that's another thing nobody has mentioned. There's an accreditation organization. It's international, really. And what Burlington, for example, has to do is they have about, I think it may be up close to 30 standards now, maybe more, that they have to follow. One of those standards is they have to, I believe they have to document every incident of force that they use. Any officer uses has to be documented. And there's just many, many other standards that they have to meet in order to receive their accreditation. And a lot of departments take this pretty serious. And they actually have a standards group within the department in Burlington that keeps up with the records and works on it every day. Because in the end, once a year, I think it's once a year, the accreditation team, and Chief Smythe can probably explain all this better, but they come in and they camp out. They literally camp out in your department for days, and they go through every record. And if you have a blemish on that record, then your accreditation is in jeopardy. And not all departments are accredited. Burlington was one of the first to get accreditation. And Chief Smythe has done a great job in carrying that forward and improving the standards and improving the work that they do. I'll flip over to on the state level. Talking about training, the highway patrol. When you go into the highway patrol, you you literally leave home and you go to Raleigh and you are there for almost 9 months, every day of extensive training. I mean, you move into a dormitory down in Raleigh and it's from sun up to sundown every day, extensive training. And that goes on. And that's a lot of training and a lot of time, to be away from your family to go to Raleigh and spend that time in training. But that's what you have to go through in order to be a state trooper. So I think the training is there. I don't think it's equal across the board. I think that when you get into some of the different communities, you probably have communities that have very little training. And then you've got areas where you have extensive training. Fortunately, I live in Burlington, which has a department that I think does an excellent job in trying to do it right. And I know Chief Smythe works every day at trying to do it better. So I think the training mechanism is there. It just needs to be equal across the board. And then as far as the other areas, I think we just need to really take a serious look at where funding is going and make sure that we have the right professionals. Because you can't, let's face it, you can't wear all the hats. You just can't do it. There's no individual out there that I know of that can do it. Very few. So you have to make sure you have the right hat in the right place at the right time.
Great, thank you. Ashley, let's go to some of the questions.
Sure. So there is a question here actually from Chief Smythe that asks, inquire for your degree, then is there a way to increase the wages that police officers receive to attract those individuals? So I'm not sure who this might be directed to, but Representative Ross or.
Well, I'll give it a try.
Yeah, go ahead, Chief Caldwell. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Representative.
When I first became mayor, we had openings all over the department because our salaries had fallen behind, and we were losing officers would come in and go through training and then instantly go to Guilford County or to the state or different agencies. So you could go just about anywhere and get paid higher. And so what we did in Burlington was we made a very conscious effort to revamp the entire payroll system for our department. And after that was put in place, we couldn't find an opening. We had people lined up that wanted a job because there were no longer openings. And you have to pay the right kind of wage in order to attract the good officers and to retain those officers. And we recognize that. And we've done the same thing now in state government with the Highway Patrol. We've done a total revamp of their pay system and tried to get that competitive because we were losing state troopers back to the local departments because they could go to a local department and make more money. And this goes on and on. Salaries are something that it's a moving target. You can fix it one day and within a year or two, you're behind again. So it's, and I think the chief would probably agree. It's something you've got to stay on top of. You want to make sure that you're paying the right amount of money to attract the right officers and at the same time retain those officers. Those are your two goals.
So Representative Ross, when will we do the same for teachers' salaries?
Well, we have had a number of teacher salary increases in about 7 to be exact, in the last so many years. And we now rank number 2 in the Southeast as far as our salaries are concerned. There's only one state that's ahead of us. I mean, we outrank Virginia. I mean, we outrank every state in the South except for Georgia. That's the one state that still got us by a fraction. So we're making progress. It's not something that you walk in and flip a switch and all of a sudden, you're number one. I mean, it's just something that takes a lot of work. It's a lot of money. And it's one of the biggest parts of the state budget. It is the biggest part of the state budget.
Other questions, Ashley?
Switching gears a little less of a question, but I think, Dawn, maybe you can address this as Casey and Kennedy kind of had. Defund the police is sometimes a confusing term because sometimes it doesn't really mean to defund, but rather reimagine or reinvent. So, Dawn, what would your idea of a reimagined police look like?
What a reimagined police force looks like would be one that is not is highly trained and well educated. And when I say highly trained and well educated, I mean not just in tactical means, but also educated in interpersonal interactions, psychological interactions, strong de-escalation, strong emphasis on community and building community and serving community. I think that we talk a lot about training, but we don't put enough emphasis on what types of training that we want to see and how we want to see that training shift. I think we see much smaller law enforcement departments, law enforcement agencies that are equipped or that are staffed and peopled by the absolute cream of the crop, and we pay them well for the role that we're asking them to serve in our communities. I see them, in my mind, doctors and lawyers should be on the same par with teachers and police officers, but no one should really be higher than police officers, again, because they can kill us. They have guns, right? They have a license to kill us if they feel like it is warranted, with little to no impunity, okay? So I think what that looks like is that we create a society where we have very small law enforcement departments that are incredibly well equipped, also well paid, and also have a strong understanding of the history of law enforcement in our country and are committed to upending and ripping up from the roots the historical nature of our law enforcement agencies in America and being committed to planting a new tree, to building something new that is really equitable and really fair. I would also like for us to see what safety looks like is investing in communities. Investing in people. I would like to see a time where, or a world where we don't have crimes of poverty and where poverty is not the catalyst, the main catalyst for introducing folks into the criminal justice system as it is right now. What does that mean? That looks like making sure people have stable homes, making sure kids have well-funded schools, making sure that there are school nurses and everyone in your communities and everyone in all of our communities have full access to healthcare and can earn a living wage and can afford to have stable housing. And all of those things are incredibly attainable if we commit to, number one, acknowledging that the system that we have is irreparably broken, and number two, committing to building a new system. And I also think, though, that one of the most important things that we haven't talked about here is reimagining what justice looks like also means fixing the harm of the broken system that we currently have. That means that we have got to acknowledge and address the trauma, the deep generational trauma that Black people have in America with law enforcement, and to rebuild that relationship, to address those underlying psychological mental health issues that are accompanied by folks who have, what amounts to post-traumatic stress and developed coping mechanisms as it relates to that untreated trauma that are unhealthy. We need to address all of those things in order to get to a place where again, I am out of a job because there is no longer a need for advocacy. Officer Caldwell is Chief Caldwell is out of a job because, or not out of a job, but he's being paid much better for the work that he's already doing. And he has much fewer folks on his watch. I just think it's important that we not forget and understand the colossity of what we're talking about, but also understand historically and contextually
This is not a feat that is unachievable, right? When we talked about ending slavery as a nation, that was also met with very similar pushback, right? Very similar uncertainty about what society looks like without this institution that we have based our economic and social grids on. But we did that. And on the other side, we came out better for it. This is a similar moment. It is time for us to radically reimagine law enforcement.
And none of this is new. You know, this predates all of us. Angela Davis was talking about this question of our prisons obsolete way back in the 80s, and everybody thought she was some left-wing radical crazy person. And here we are still trying to engage the same question. But this work is long, it's hard, but you have to be tenacious about it. I wonder if we could speak a little bit though about the issue of community policing. And if you, in this reimagining or thinking about officers who are the cream of the crop, well-educated, well-trained, know their community, should they live in the communities that they police? So right now, you know, we have, I think with most local agencies, we don't have high percentages of officers who live in the communities that they patrol. And that, I think, is part of the problem.
So if I could speak to that, yeah, that's certainly an issue that exists in a majority of the law enforcement agencies, and certainly in our state. And it's a tough one. You know, we try and engage with our community partners, from our social groups to our faith-based community, to try and reach out and say, hey, we're looking for people from Mebane that we want to see and be a part of the police department's team to serve this community. And, you know, honestly, that's a $1 million question right now, you all. We can't find that officer. I'm thinking about my roster as we speak, and I think I may have on a roster of 37 sworn, maybe 3 of my officers are from the Mebane community. And, you know, so that's not very realistic to obtain right now, being transparent with y'all. So we shift gears into looking for that officer that wants to come and serve a community. And again, you'll say, gosh, Chief, you keep repeating the same things, but it goes back to agency culture, agency administration. How are you recruiting? What are you recruiting? You know, for me, and my thing is, if you don't pass that test of wanting to be a community member, because our policing philosophy is community-oriented policing. And if you don't get through the screening to suggest that you're going to be committed to the Mebane community, you may have a 4-year degree. You may have a picture-perfect background, maybe even some military attached. But if the indicators are not there to suggest that you're going to be a fit for the community, then you're probably not going to make it with Team Mebane. I'll share with y'all, I had an interesting conversation with one of my neighboring sheriffs last week. And, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, you know, law enforcement, where we're talking about finding that great officer, right? That good officer, you know, we're losing a lot of those officers right now. So we're kind of, you know, fighting that double-edged sword of weeding out those that shouldn't be a part, while trying to retain those that we would love to continue to be a part of our team, but are opting out of the profession right now. And it's, you know, that makes it even more tough to sustain your workforce through these tough times. But, you know, what the sheriff and I agreed upon was that, you know, we're going to go through some tough times as a community, right? And as police departments and sheriff's departments. But at the end of the day, at the end of the day, you cannot settle for less than those that want to come help the community. And I've said it 3 or 4 times, I'll say it again. If the agency head does not set that culture, that standard of excellence and commitment to an officer coming to serve that community, then you're going to have problems. You know, some things can't be avoided. We all get that. You know, incidents are going to happen, but you minimize the risk and the opportunity for that to happen when you're selecting the right people. I want to take a minute too to address some things that Casey said, just to bring clarification to it, because she made some very good points. You talked about training. My good friend Chief Smythe, and he's going to jump on me if I steal his example one more time. But you know, let's talk about training. And Casey, you asked and you were talking about, is there enough? I will tell you that absolutely no, there is not. And I will tell you that the discussion at least has started at the chief's level in terms of how we can increase and extend training, certainly at the entry level. And the example that I'll use again, Chief Smythe knows what I'm getting ready to say, is that in the state of North Carolina, to become a barber, for me to cut Mr. Ross's hair, it requires 1,500 hours of training before I get my certification. In the state of North Carolina, for me to be a police officer, to be given a gun and be granted the authority to use deadly force if necessary, it only requires 720 hours. So do we see that as a problem as agency heads collectively? Absolutely. That's got to change. We really got to look at a higher level at what we are allowing these young men and women to come out onto the streets with. And it starts with looking at this 720 hours of basic law enforcement training that we feel has got to be increased. The standard, again, the agency, Mr. Ross talked about CALEA, Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. Less than 5% of law enforcement agencies in the United States have achieved accreditation status. Burlington Police has, Grand Police has, the Mebane Police Department has achieved accreditation status. That sets a standard that compels an agency to perform at a much higher level. At the end of the day, you're right, it requires us to report different statistics, record different statistics, and it requires a level of transparency that a lot of agencies don't have to do. And so when you start to put all those things together, then I think you start to at least internally rebuild and reconstruct what really a law enforcement agency should do. There's 110 standards, which translates into about 460 or so policies that the commission requires that you adhere to on a yearly basis. And we're checked, we're audited by assessors that come from out of state generally. Our last assessors came from, I think, Illinois, one from Illinois, one from the state of Florida, to evaluate. So there's no brotherhood of the blue love when these guys and ladies show up at your department to check your standards and check your proofs to see if you're doing what you say that you're doing. Because the evidence has to be in place when they come. It just raises the bar for law enforcement agencies. So we challenge others to meet that standard. You know, if you want to tell your community members that you're doing what you can to serve them in the best way possible, then raise that standard. The thing, Casey, that we have to be concerned about with agencies not in this area. You take the Louisville situation, for example, and some of the others is a lot of law enforcement agencies are controlled by unions. And I think that's starting to kind of resonate around these discussions now. And I can't really speak to how powerful unions actually are, but they are. We all know that. Anybody that kind of knows the concept of unions, they have a strong impact, especially on larger law enforcement agencies in terms of agency termination. So that old standard that we talked about, transparency, a while back, and making everybody aware, maybe it's a little bit different when it comes to unionized law enforcement agencies. I just say thank goodness that we're not unionized in the state of North Carolina, because I think that would create a whole different set of issues that we would be working through. So.
Chief, I was earlier. I'm sorry. I was just joking with the chief. Is that maybe why he has no ear? I use Chief Smythe's example all the time as well. But we're running short on time, and you said quite a bit for us. We haven't even touched the issue of police unions, which I hope that we get into next week when we have our episode, The Clash of Black and Blue. But I think that what you said about community is so important, and I just wondered quickly if members of your community are part of the hiring process. So you talk a lot about them being very community focused, but do you have a lot of community members as part of the assessment team to look at the fit of new hires?
Okay, that's a good question. In the city of Mebane, we do not. We hire on a rate of, first of all, our turnover ratio is extremely low. We hire on such a low rate, at such a low rate, that it makes it tough to organize a group outside of our agency to vet, if you will, applicants. I think that's what you're asking me, to be a part of the vetting process, if nothing else. And as these discussions continue, we are open, and I think most of our law enforcement partners are, to at what point in time do we start to combine, right, our non-law enforcement partners with regards to the hiring process, and then secondarily to a review process, if you will. Those discussions are ongoing as we speak. So while again, I'm very transparent to say we don't have that in place. But for an agency, I think that's in pretty good shape overall, we don't feel like we're immune to what's happening around our country and our nation. And so if you want to be proactive, if you want to set the standard, you have to hear what your community members are saying to you and asking of you, and be willing not only to engage in dialogue, but to act as a result of the communication that's ongoing.
I just, if I could just real quick, we don't have unions, but the Police Benevolence Association and the Sheriff's Association are incredibly powerful lobbies, and Representative Ross can speak to that. And they control a whole lot of what does and does not happen as it relates to law enforcement on a state and local level, because of the way that they are able to use those lobbies. So while North Carolina is not a police union state, we have the police and law enforcement in North Carolina have incredibly strong lobbies. I worked for a lot of years to try to get the age raised in North Carolina, and our biggest obstacle, as we were the last state in the country to getting the age raised, was the sheriffs. So the Sheriff's Association. So make no mistakes, they have no lobby. They have no unions, but their lobby is so strong that if they had a union, my goodness, I can't even imagine what it would look like.
So we're gonna just make the rounds. Maybe Casey and Kennedy, you want to respond to anything that the other panelists have said?
Yeah, so I was going to just say, it sounds like to me what we really need to be changing here outside of defunding, defending, or dismantling the police is the culture at its root. Because it sounds like to me the root of this problem, the string that will pull this knot apart, is the culture that surrounds the police. And so because we don't have people who are from these communities coming in, which is a massive issue, and I feel like we should have some sort of rule that you have to be in a community for so long, because when we have people coming in from outside, it is a little tougher, I think. Like, yes, we need people who just want to help, but at the same time, they should also be familiar with, to some degree, the community that they also happen to be serving. I think that's an important thing that we need to have happen. I mean, I don't want somebody from New York coming to North Carolina, where the cultures are just immensely different there. I mean, yes, I would love them to come and help me if there's like if they want to be passionate about that, that's a wonderful thing. But coming from New York, you wouldn't have exactly the best idea on North Carolina culture and the issues that we face here, because yes, we aren't unionized, but I do believe that, and correct me if I'm wrong, New York has unions. So they'd be coming from a unionized state to non-unions and things like that. So the culture that surrounds police and just even in the public eye, but the culture that surrounds police too, because we also glorify in the public eye the police. And there are shows like Cops. I mean, I know that Cops is no longer a thing anymore, but we glorify police in a way. And so unraveling that culture and really being honest about what not only police do, but also how we think of police, I think is a really important thing to think about before we can really start to defund, defend, or dismantle the police, to bring in the title of this seminar.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say also going off of what Kennedy said, like it also is about changing the culture, but then it is also about changing laws and policies. And I'm, if anyone wants to talk about like what we as a community and what people in power in Congress, in the House of Representatives can do to start changing these policies. I use the example of when they basically banned the right to protest in the city of Graham. And the ACLU did say that, hey, you can't do that. And then they lifted it, but nobody was held accountable for that. And I see it in cities all over the world where peaceful protesters are attacked, or Black people who did not commit any crime, any minority who didn't commit a crime and isn't a threat to anyone, are attacked and beaten or even killed, and nobody's held accountable. So what laws can we put in place, can we vote into place, so that, again, no matter who is in the agency determining who hires who or whatever, if an officer does something that is illegal or unconstitutional or does not, or unjustly harms or kills somebody who was not a threat, how can we then they automatically get removed and fired? I just don't think we have enough laws and policies in place that govern what an officer can and can't do. And I could be wrong, maybe they are there and we're just ignoring them, but even if that's the case, how do we then start enforcing those laws again?
Wonderful.
2 words, your locally elected district attorney. It is their job to prosecute law enforcement officers who violate the law, and they are not doing it. In tandem, they are not doing it.
Representative Ross.
Well, a lot of the different things that we're talking about, if you look at changing the culture, obviously the first place you got to start is really in education and training. And obviously education and training in all forms of law enforcement is not the same. It's a mixed bag. It's different all over. Small agencies may have little to no training, or you may even have a larger agency for whatever reason has little to no training. I think that the process has got to include enough training. The chief, Evans chief, talked about the need for more. I think there needs to be more training, but I think part of that training needs to be an educational process as to how do we change the culture? What's going on? What do we do to be responsive and understand our community? Every community is different to some degree, and you've got to understand that community. And I think through a better process of education and training, we can maybe move in the right direction to try to get to where we need to be. And I used to tell my department heads in Burlington, let's go out and do the best job you can today. And then I want you to come back in tomorrow and try to do it better than you did today, and so forth each day thereafter. And I think we have to look at that in law enforcement also. Go out today and do the best job you can to serve and protect, just like it says on the car. And then come back in tomorrow and try to do a better job than you did today. And if we all did that, I think ultimately we would get to a much better position.
Thank you. And Attorney Blagrove, parting words.
Thank you for having me. This has been a really frank and honest conversation. I want to thank Chief Caldwell for his transparency and his honesty during this conversation. You just don't get that very often. Final words is, you all, this is a real problem, but it's a real problem that we can fix. It is addressable and we can do it. Where there is political will and there is desire on the part of those stakeholders to fix this problem, we can fix it. And if they don't have the will, then as individual citizens and voters, it is your job to help them create the will or replace them.
Thank you. Neighbors, thank you again for tuning in to The Core, and we hope that you will join us next Monday at 5:30 for our session, The Clash of Black and Blue, with another exciting lineup of panelists. Have a good evening and be safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.